Welcome to The World Today. I'm Waqas Majeed Khan. Today we're talking about the latest announcement by Iran, where they have said that they will lift its nuclear enrichment capacity. And that is a troubling news because we're seeing that the Americans, after having pulled out from the Iran nuclear deal, left the Europeans in quite a quandary vis-a-vis them upholding their part of the deal. So we'll talk about that and see where this entire conflict is now headed, which is between Iran, the US, and Israel also has something to say. And our second topic has to do with something much closer to our hearts and our home, and that is a national malaise, which is religious terrorism that has taken root in our country, and we'll talk about how we can get rid of this menace which is threatening every single individual in society. Let's begin the conversation. I'd like to introduce my guests in the studio. Joining me for the discussion today, first of all, we have AVM ikram bhatti Saab with us, and joining him we have Mohammad Sheraz. Thank you, sir, for being here. So let's begin with Iran's announcement. They say that they will keep within the limits of their enrichment, which they promised in the 2015 nuclear deal, but that process can be swung into industrial level enrichment should the deal further unravel. And what we are seeing now, sir, is that the deal is unraveling slowly and surely. So where do you think this entire issue is going to head off to?
See, at this stage, the ball is in the court of European Union. The signatories to this agreement were 5+, not just one, 5+2. But it was the permanent members of the Security Council, the 5 countries, Iran and the European Union. And all these have different interests and roles in this agreement. While America essentially was there to enforce the agreement, and the European Union, in fact, was providing the economic benefits to Iran or in incentives for them to actually adhere to this agreement and benefit from it, and of course adhere to the restrictions, which was very invasive. Now when the Americans pull out, that means the enforcement is no longer there.
But sir, IAEA is also a body which oversees nuclear activity all across the world. So their job is also enforcement. So they're still there in Iran and they're still observing what's happening.
But when we speak in the context of this agreement,
sir,
the role of America essentially was to enforce it. So they are no longer there. And if now it is up to the European Union to keep the remainder of the agreement intact or not. Because if the European Union also adheres to it, then of course the Iranians will be pushed against the wall, and then they'll be forced to continue with the nuclear enrichment, going to industrial and then maybe to the weapon grade enrichment. And but the Europeans, we know that they also stand to benefit a lot from this agreement, because take the case of just the Airbus industry. They have a contract for $22 billion worth of civilian airliners. Similarly, there are several other countries who indulge into trade with Iran, essentially exports, and they import, of course, Iranian oil. So they stand to lose a lot if Iran pulls out or the agreement crumbles altogether. And on the other hand, of course, Iranians are going to be subjected to very severe economic restrictions. So it is now the European Union which can keep the agreement intact and functioning, but the fact is that if the Europeans want to keep it intact, then they'll have to go against the American interests, because the Americans have stated very clearly that any company which does business with Iran would be sanctioned by the US.
And sir, we've seen a trickle effect of that very statement, because a number of European companies working in Iran have already started winding down their business, despite the fact that the deal has not unraveled from the European side. They're still working on it, but we're seeing that the companies are now starting to pull out of Iran. Sheraz, in your opinion, when we talk about Iran agreeing to limit their uranium enrichment to under 5%, they are still adhering to that, and they say that they will continue to adhere to that. as long as they see that the Europeans are able to uphold their end of the bargain. But that is also looking very untenable as the days go by. So in your opinion, how is this going to impact Iran if they start their nuclear program once again internationally?
Well, before internationally, regionally, as you have mentioned about how Israel is eyeing it, the Iranian nuclear program. Secondly, Saudi Arabia itself. So if you just take a back seat and try to look into what's happening at the moment in Middle East, and especially with the Iranian nuclear deal, you will come to the reality, which is United States of America and the situation in Middle East is obviously collaborating hand in hand of what to do with what happens with the Iranian nuclear deal. So that is what is taking place at the moment right now. Iranian influence have increased manifold in the Middle East after this revolution, Arab Spring, and then Daesh, after Daesh as well. So there is a significant increase as far as influence of Iran in Middle East is concerned. Iraq, Syria, so on and so forth. US is also not having a good, you can say, to an extent, adventure in Middle East for that matter. The Middle East has become a quagmire of fair politics for everybody sitting there. So at the moment, Russia and party are having an edge over the rest of the you can say competitors over there. So that's very important to understand the backdrop of what is taking place over there. So if the United States of America is out of it, then most probably it won't be able to sustain itself for long. European Union can sustain it but I don't think so. European Union will, you can say, put its own relationship at threat with the United States of America on the basis of this Iranian nuclear deal. It doesn't seems to be the case in the recent future, at least. So what we will see, we will definitely see a gradual, you can say, a gradual end to this commitment. And obviously, once that it becomes clear and apparent that this deal cannot sustain itself, then the implications which you are mentioning about how it will implicate in the region, the implications for the region, the implications will be an arms race, and a nuclear one, obviously. Everyone wants to get hold of these nuclear weapons in the region, because even if they can't build it, they will buy it. So that's how it's going to impact the regional situation. And once that takes place, obviously, that transition period from a conventional to a strategic balance of power, obviously it will have its stall on the global, you can say, political order for that matter. So yes, there are severe implications. But as far as at the contemporary situation, if we may say, India Iran relationship, it will also be affected by this deal. Obviously, the Chabahar port that will also go through certain changes and certain phases because of this withdrawal. And obviously, the relationship between Europe and US will also take a little bit, if not a very apparent setback, but will have a setback, because European Union, though off the record they are not in favor, they don't consider it as an ideal deal, but obviously they think it's something to talk about. We can always move from there to a more comprehensive, a more, you can say, West complacent deal, if you may say, which somehow addresses their interest as far as Iranian nuclear program is concerned. But not having a deal at all together, it is not in favor of anybody. So I would say that that's the problem, that's the issue, the regional one as well, leading to the kind of reaction by United States of America, and then the United States of America, European Union, and the implications if once this deal is completely over, then Saudi Arabia and Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iran and Israel especially, because then again we cannot completely side by the Israeli view, because that has happened once before as well.
Speaking of Israel, sir, we've had statements coming out from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He's also on a whirlwind tour of Europe right now, meeting various European leaders, trying to, I think, jockey for position vis-a-vis the Iran nuclear deal, maybe trying to bring them onto his thought process. regarding Iran. How do you think that's going to play out, sir? Do you think that the European Union would be willing to accept Mr. Netanyahu's warmongering and fear-inducing rhetoric, which he's very fond of spewing forth?
You see, we must keep in mind that Israel already has nuclear weapons for the last several decades. It's a known hidden fact.
An open secret, as
An
they
open
say.
secret. And this agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, essentially was aimed at preventing Iran in acquiring nuclear capability. And it introduced the most intrusive ever inspections to ensure that Iran does not venture into this capability and keeps its enrichment to only
less than 5%.
less than, in fact, to 3.5%, which is sufficient for to be used as a fuel for nuclear power plants. And the Iranians agreed to it. And in turn, of course, all the sanctions against Iran, especially the economic sanctions, were to be lifted, and which was a benefit for everybody, for the Europeans, for the Americans, and for the Iranians. But the Saudis and the Israelis view this, that if there is an economic benefit to Iran, then Iran's capacity to interfere into its region is going to increase manifold. And despite all these sanctions so far, if Iran has been able to reach all the way to Morocco, which has lately terminated its diplomatic relations with Iran because of Iran's interference and support to the secessionists over there. And we already know about Yemen, we already know about Iraq, we know about Syria. So with all this right in front of us, the concerns of Saudi Arabia and Israel from that perspective are real, because if Iran, despite all the restrictions, could do this, and now when it gets a respite and all the sanctions are lifted, and it can have an additional economic muscle, and it can able to influence European Union and other big players in the world, then it will be able to play a lot more in the region than what it is doing right now. And they fear that eventuality, and hence they have co-opted America into it to undo the deal. Because when you look at it, I fail to understand what is the benefit of the Americans in this in scuttling this deal.
It's actually detrimental for American security.
Yes.
By scuttling this deal, that this is what President Obama said, that it was the best deal to secure America's national interest. So walking away from the deal is basically going against the American national interest.
So when you look back and you see who is the beneficiary of this scuttling exercise,
Well, it seems that Israel is the main beneficiary, sir.
Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Of course, that seems to be the case. Now we're looking at a situation where the Europeans expect the Iranian nation to tolerate and grapple with sanctions, to give up their nuclear activities and have a really tough time living. So it's a very bullying sort of a stance that the rest of the powers are taking towards Iran. Do you think the Iranians are going to take that sitting down? Don't you think that they will react even harder to such, such hard-hitting sanctions and making the lives of the Iranian people miserable?
Iran has been experienced in all those kind of time periods where sanctions were slammed on them, and they have gone through. They probably have gone through many worse situations in the past as well.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Sheraz. I want to ask you this question also, which is part of it, that the demand by Iran, which is mainly guaranteed purchases of Iranian oil and free bank transfers. Now, that is the real key over here, because banking institutions in Iran are the ones that are going to be the most affected by these sanctions. So that's going to make life very difficult for the Iranian government and the Iranian people, as I said. But do you think that the Europeans have the capacity to deliver on this particular promise, that they can guarantee that Iranian oil will be sold and their money will be repatriated to their banks?
Well, that's very interesting situation. But that's what I indicated earlier, the relationship between European Union and US itself, how far European Union can sustain that. Because if US is behaving like a bully as far as this Iranian nuclear deal is concerned for European Union. Then there is another bully for the European Union sitting on the border, on the eastern border as well, Russia. So, you know, that can always be activated and used against European Union in order to, you know, create some kind of sympathy for United States of America, and then, at the end, by the end of the day, the deal is over. So, to an extent, the power possibilities which can exist over there. So, if that is the case, the kind of relationship which they share, and it's also in the notice of the Iranian state itself, what happened to those countries who agreed to fully surrender their nuclear programs.
Yeah, that is an example for the rest of the world to see.
To see, so, yes,
and maybe learn from.
And especially for Iran, for that matter, you know. So there are certain apprehensions, and and the capabilities which you have mentioned about from conventional to unconventional use, you know, that is from power generation to bomb making. So for that, I don't think so. They have completely surrendered that idea. There are certain levels of expertise which they might have gained. That's why eventually they entered into this arrangement, you know. So obviously they are confident of the fact that if it does not work, obviously they will have to go back and look and find some ways in order to make sure their national security. Because if it's a national security question for United States of America, as they have mentioned, and for Israel, similarly, it's an equally national interest or national security issue for Iran not having nuclear weapons, you know, after the failure of Iranian nuclear deal. So that is a very clear, you're coming up front clearly that what are the possibilities. The possibilities are survival of the Iranian regime itself. So if that's the case, then eventually it's going to be a very clear-cut confrontation, and then you will see that confrontation not in Iran for that matter, maybe indirectly through sanctions and other means, but most probably it is going to be you know, making its shape, its face within the Middle Eastern countries, where Iranians have been able to, you can say, construct a kind of influence over the past 10 to 15 years, you know. So we will see more agitation in Middle East for that matter, and obviously sanction-wise, Iran will have to suffer more as far as sanctions are concerned. Then if there are going to be sanctions, then there are going to be illegal trades.
Right. It's a very dangerous situation that's developing, sir, within the region vis-a-vis Iran. There was this concept of punishing people for crimes that they would commit in the future. And this seems to be one of those cases where Iran has become a target or a victim of this sort of a policy, that they must be preemptive strike, or if I recall, there was a film about it called Minority Report. So here we have Iran in that very
scenario,
unfortunate and unenviable position. So, sir, we saw Iraq happen because they were accused of having weapons of mass destruction, which they never had. And here we have Iran, which have uranium and are talking about enriching it. So do you think the Iranians are also playing a dangerous game by announcing this and maybe inviting the wrath of the Americans and say, look, the Iranians are enriching uranium, we have to take them out, and we have a very, very dangerous situation developing here, sir?
Well, the Iranians, of course, know it as to how far they can go. And they are, of course, quite seasoned and quite used to such like situation, because they are withstanding this for the last nearly 40 years. And I think the role of China, Russia and the European Union, and with North Korea as an example, would play a lot in shaping Iran's reaction or behavior, because they think, and they do not take out a knee-jerk reaction. They think it positively, and they very wisely and intelligently they come out with their response. And I'm sure they're going to think it over. They'll be in touch with China, they'll be in touch with Russia, and of course they're already talking a lot with the European Union to make sure that the ill effects of the scuttling of this deal do not go to an extent where the Iranians have to actually resort to increasing their enrichment to industrial and even to weapon grade. But I think we can still count on the European Union to be able to withstand American pressure. If you look at in the history, we find in 1956 the Americans and the Europeans were quite at odds when the Suez Canal was invaded. And in fact, Eisenhower threatened UK that it will start to sell sterling pound bonds, thereby affecting UK's economy. And UK's embarrassment in 1956 was in fact the end of UK's world power status. And subsequently in 2003, when the Gulf War was to take place, it was Germany and France who opposed the USA. So there is history, but at that time you see it was not entire Europe, it was a few countries who were opposing the US. But in this case, in case of this agreement, it is almost the entire European Union which is involved. And they have huge stakes, huge interests. And of course, they get oil at a preferential price from Iran. They get to sell a lot of their products to Iran. They make good economic benefit from there. Similarly, even India is going to be affected, whereas the Indians were allowed to continue to import Iranian oil despite all the sanctions. I don't know when the Americans say that these will be stringent ever sanctions, what will happen to Chabar as just mentioned, and what about the sale of Iranian oil to India?
The Indians have already said that they will not be dictated foreign policy by any third country, meaning whether it's the US or anybody else. And if you look at their history, they have pretty much stuck to that sort of a stance.
Well, they know of their leverage with the US because they are being used against the Chinese.
So we are seeing a situation where the Indians still may be allowed to buy Iranian oil, whereas other countries will be stopped from buying it. So how do you justify this sort of it becomes a moral conundrum, sir, when we talk about one country being given special treatment at the cost of another?
Well, you see, in international relations, morality has no place. These are interests which govern these relationships and dealing with each other. So if the interests coincide, morality is not a factor. In fact, it is not a factor anywhere on the international scenario. So
maybe that's the problem, sir. Sheraz, would you like to say something?
Afghanistan is an interesting point over here. Why Afghanistan? Because Afghanistan is helping India further its foreign policy to Central Asian states, to patch up its relationship with Russia, right? And then to keep an eye on Pakistan from the other end as well. So in Afghanistan, United States of America and India are on the same page. According to some explanations given by some one of our spy masters, in a recent book with an Indian spy master, it was India is towing US foreign policy in Afghanistan under their umbrella. So that's very clear, right? So if that's the case, that it means in the region, they can very easily say that yes, we will do whatever we want to do, but when it comes to actually executing that against the interest of the one or sole superpower, so to speak, at the moment, still the superpower, maybe remain a superpower for the next 50 years as well, it's not going to be as easy for India to implement that policy statement as it's easily said by India. So that is another dimension of how India will respond to it. Because if we talk about the European Union, as mentioned earlier, European Union, then again, they have their own interests as well. They cannot completely ignore United States of America in order to safeguard this. So you have to have a cost benefit, the rational actor model, which one is supported by rationality. So yes, they will try to find a middle path where obviously this Iranian nuclear deal survives to an extent where.
But it also sort of gives the impression that the US, first of all, by walking away from the nuclear deal, and then the Israeli Prime Minister harping on the fact that look what's happening, they've started to, or they're talking about restarting their nuclear uranium enrichment. They're creating a narrative which is to isolate Iran internationally, but they're the ones who are creating this the situation, or they're creating the they're creating the environment in which Iran is going to be, looked on as or propagated as a pariah state, and a most dangerous country for the well-being of the entire planet.
Humanity,
and then,
yes.
And then they're going to, try to take them
the
out.
same case,
They're creating
history,
that narrative. We've seen all this happening before.
But the timings,
it's the same old script.
The timings, when the nuclear deal was struck, what was the scenario right then? It was a situation
No, my
where
question, Sheraz,
Yeah.
is that can the rest of the world, which is part of the United Nations, take this matter up with the United Nations? The United Nations Security Council should be approached by rest of the world against what Israel and America are up to.
and in the recent history, what we have seen a very open use of veto.
Right.
Every now and then.
Yes.
Issue of Palestine. Earlier, there have been issues regarding the region, and the United States of America threatened to use veto, and at times, went ahead with that. So if something like that comes up over there in the Security Council, then we should also expect these kind of threats from United States of America, which they have been recently. They have been less diplomatic and very direct, and when it comes to their diplomacy in United Nations, for that matter.
Well, their opening salvo line is usually, if I can quote President George W. Bush Jr., "We'll bomb you to the Stone Age." That's what they say. How can you stand against that? Well, sir, let's leave this topic and move on to our next one, which is far more important and much closer to home, sir. There's a very interesting editorial in the Tribune today, sir, and that is where we are taking our cue from. Religious terrorism, sir, has been identified in the National Internal Security Policy as the #1 threat to the safety of Pakistani individuals and across the world as well. Religious terrorism is something that has been identified as something very, very worrying. But sir, when we equate religion with terrorism, can we not decipher, or can we not separate the fact that religion has nothing to do with terrorism, and it is the terrorists that are using religion or misusing religion for their own nefarious ends? How can we counter this particular trend of the terrorists using religion for their ulterior motives? This is the real question, sir.
I think it emanates out of our lack of education, our poor state of literacy in the country. And when we talk of religion as in the domain of terrorism, I think it is militant intolerance.
Absolutely, sir. It's religious intolerance is something else.
It's militant intolerance, actually.
Oh, yes, of course.
It's militant intolerance which actually leads on to terrorism on the behest of religion. And essentially it emanates out of intolerance. And intolerance emanates out of lack of understanding your own religion. And if you are well educated, well versed in your own religion, you will be tolerant and you will be accommodate difference of opinion, difference of views, and of course accept each other.
But is there any religion in the world, sir, that says that killing people is a good thing?
Certainly not. There have been so many fatwas by so many religious scholars that,
so which proves the fact that it's not really a religious issue, is it?
It is certainly not. It is basically an issue of education. We have not been able to educate our people, and especially in religion. And wherever we have religious education, alongside they are teaching intolerance. And then which borders on to militant intolerance. I mean, they are just not willing to accept a difference of opinion, difference of view.
That's right, sir. And we're seeing that across the board.
That is because of lack of education. And the day we are able to focus more on education, I think we'll be more tolerant, we'll be more accommodative, there'll be no militancy, and there will be just no religious terrorism.
Another very interesting point that the National Internal Security Policy highlighted was that terrorism overall is a self-inflicted wound. What exactly do you think that they were referring to? If you would please clarify that point.
Yes, because before the program we were discussing about what Qaid said, how the state should be.
Right.
The responsibility of the state.
Absolutely.
And what it can, where it can interfere and where it cannot interfere.
Absolutely.
So that's the problem. That's from
if we go back to the words of the Qaid.
Yes, so it is self-inflicted.
He said religion has
nothing to do with
the business of the state. But here we have a situation
So,
where...
as my colleague mentioned about the tolerance,
Absolutely.
how much are we tolerant about it? It's a political issue. How much we have seen it to try to resolve it politically. How many times we have given that a chance, a sincere chance. Sincerity has not been there whenever you try to resolve it politically. You always wanted to get it resolved through the hammer.
So it's a lot of it has to do with some forces or people wanting to control the lives of other people according to their own wishes. Is that what we are witnessing here?
It was a political question. It started after the first Afghan invasion. Pakistan had nothing to do with intolerance.
Absolutely.
Pakistani culture and society was a vibrant one. We had visitors, we had foreigners living here in the streets of Rawalpindi, for that matter, Peshawar.
Right.
So how that a vibrant culture, a vibrant society such as Pakistani had changed altogether in a matter of only a decade or so. So there was an upper hand involved. We have to face our failures. We cannot just go ahead with putting cover on what we did in our past and try to resolve it through other means. One thing. Second, I will definitely try to come to other issues regarding the same thing. But most importantly, the mistake which we have made after choosing, letting people decide their own perception or definition of religion was then again the issue. Without having a clear knowledge that we need to stop glorifying the gun now as a state, as an institution, and so on and so forth. We haven't done that. So without abandoning that policy of glorifying the gun, how can you expect to make ways for tolerance and peace in your own society?
Absolutely.
So even for peaceful, even for something which can be constructive, you use gun to construct. Gun has become a popular culture in Pakistan, which was not the case. So I think these are some of the historical mistakes which we have made. Until we face our fears, we will never succeed.
Totally
if we don't face our fears, they will grow stronger.
Absolutely.
And that is going to be intolerance. It is going to be more extremist. It's going to be chunks of peace, silence, and then something went off. So that is not peace. That is not a resolution. As in many previous programs, it has been emphasized multiple times that we need to first see this problem as a political problem. It's a political problem. It's not a religious problem. In Pakistan, war on terror, we made a mistake at the global level. I'm not saying mistake because we sided with the United States of America, but the way we sided with them, that was questionable. Eventually we had to. But not this way.
All right, let's move on to the other important things that the report has highlighted, sir. And one of those things is madrasa reforms. The report highlights the fact that madrasa reforms that have been talked about endlessly have not been implemented either by the provinces, and neither has the Federation made sure that the provinces implement all the policies that are regarding madrasa reforms. So we have that issue as well, sir. Do you think anything can be done about that? Why is it that we make wonderful policies on paper, but they're never implemented, and then we have to suffer the consequences of that?
You see, providing education to the children and to the masses is the responsibility of the state. If the state does not shoulder its responsibility, a space is created, a vacuum is created, which is filled by such like informal activities. In 1947, I think there were 150 to 250 madrasas. In 1979, when
the Russian
when the Russians
invasion of
came,
Afghanistan came,
I think we were anywhere around between 500 to 1,000 madrasas. And when they left after 10 years, they were around maybe 25 or 30,000. And now they're around 40,000.
Probably more, sir.
And why have they mushroomed? Why were they allowed to mushroom? I mean, that is a clear depiction of
you said a very
state
interesting
inability.
thing, sir. If the state does not fulfill its responsibility, then who is to be held accountable for that?
The state.
And who might that be, sir?
Everybody. Everybody.
I mean, the leadership, of course.
State is not government. State are 4 to 5 institutions.
So that would that responsibility would be spread over every single.
Everybody, in fact, every citizen of the country. I mean,
is in a way responsible.
Yes.
Oh, but they have been paying for it a lot, many times. I would not blame the citizens, promisely.
So let's also talk about the lack of building a counter narrative to the extremist narrative that we've witnessed in our society. Do you think that the media has played an adequate role in addressing this very vital issue? Do you think that they've done their job at all? Because I don't think so.
You see, we had a watershed moment when the APS happened. Till then, the terrorists enjoyed very significant sympathy within the public.
Well, according to the National Internal Security Policy, sir, that is still valid. That is still true. There is some element of sympathy there as well.
If that some element of sympathy prevails, that means there is still a huge gap in our national narrative.
So what do you suggest should be the measures that should be taken in order to address this problem?
Unfortunately, our media, I think, is not shouldering its responsibility towards the building of this narrative. We still see the terrorists continue to find coverage within the media with shades of glorification. And we also see that all attempts at curbing this or developing a national narrative are not as much supported by the media, as not as much coverage is being given to that. And there is a lack of cohesion, there is lack of unity, there is lack of focus in the media. That this is a core responsibility, this is the core concern that the nation is currently facing, that we are yet to develop a comprehensive, unified national narrative against terrorism. That is yet to happen. And media is, I think, which is one, I think, organ which is supposed to bear the biggest burden of this, the biggest responsibility of this. While the state can do it, the intelligence or the academia, the judiciary or the security institutions, they can play their role, but the outreach that media has, nobody else has. Be it print, be it electronic, be it even social media, they are, I think, not shouldering their responsibility.
All right, Sheraz, we're almost out of time. Something that you'd like to share very briefly.
The narratives war is not to be fought through uniform people. That's my message. Narrative is something which is extended through scholars.
Because amazingly, I'm glad you mentioned scholars, because there have been a number of ulama councils, meetings, fatwas given time and time again regarding suicide bombings, regarding killing people.
We need to get out of cosmetic measures.
It seems to have no effect.
Measures.
What influence do you think these scholars and clerics really have on the people if it has no effect? Fatwas have no effect on people.
Change the social respect of your academia in your society.
One of the things that's important.
Yes, start from there.
That's one thing.
Yes.
One small step.
One small step.
Well, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, sir, for taking out the time and sharing your views with PTV World. Well, you heard the conversation, and as always, we urge our viewers to draw their own conclusions from what they've heard. On that note, it's goodbye.
You need to have professional journalists meeting the journalists there.
And academia, academic connections as well,
parliamentarians,
sir.
academia.
This is a whole new...
meeting their counterparts and giving their own narration.
This is another subject, sir.
Yeah.
Another show needs to be done on what needs to be done, but we don't have the time right now. But thank you so much for taking out the time and sharing your views with PTV World. Well, we are completely out of time, and as always, we like to say that do draw your own conclusions from what you've heard. But before we end the program, there is a issue which is quite, one should say, it's a lot of people are talking about it, and that is Khatija Siddiqui issue. She was attacked in broad daylight, and her attacker was convicted. And then recently, we've heard that his verdict that he was convicted for and sentenced to 7 years in prison has been overturned, and he has now been acquitted. We don't know what the real details are because it is a matter which is sub judice, but we would definitely like to comment on the fact that if there are loopholes in the law which allow convicted attackers or killers to be acquitted, then those laws really need to be reviewed, and we need to go back to the drawing board as far as that is concerned. We hope that Khatija Siddiqui gets justice, and we hope that the Chief Justice, if he sees our program, takes notice of this entire issue. On that note, it's goodbye.
Plan have more policies which create space for the open grounds and for the open forest areas. These are the things. Otherwise, in the concrete, the impact would be very worse. One thing, and second thing, the other issue of Karachi is water, which you were talking about, the water policy. The water policy of the water, unfortunately, it has been victim of the political parties' point scoring. Nobody is talking about the water as a commodity, water as a need, water as a life. Like you know that 84% of water is being given to Pakistan in the 3 months. And the rest of the years we have to survive on that water. But we don't have the dams, we don't have the reservoirs, we don't have anything like that to store the water at the large scale. Then we start blame gaming. Then what we are witnessing from the other provinces right now, Punjab is taking the water, Sindh is saying like that, Israel is not giving water. But the reality is that at this point of time, this year the availability of water is 50% less due to these different reasons. But one of the reasons is also climate change and environmental degradation. So the thing is that the situation is very complicated. I cannot tell you in the 2 minutes what should be really done. There is a comprehensive, we need a comprehensive plan. But immediate
we need
measures are needed.
a new, totally different program on this issue entirely. I think I agree with you there, sir. Well, thank you very much, Ramisa, for taking out the time and sharing your views with PTV World. Well, you heard the conversation, and in the end, we always say, please draw your own conclusions from what you've heard. And on that note, it's goodbye.